My name is Arthur, and I am 40 years your old man who has spent more time talking to the ripples on the water than to the people in the city. Because there's a silence in the deep woods that understands me better than any human ever could. And for 20 years, fishing has been my religion, my sanctuary, my only way to escape the crushing weight of a world that never stops moving. But after what happened last October at Black Glass Lake, I realized that some silences are not meant to be broken, and some waters are better left undisturbed because they hold things that have been forgotten for a reason. And I am telling you this now because I can still feel the damp chill of that night in my marrow, and every time I close my eyes, I see those rusted helmets bobbing in the dark like the severed heads of iron giants. It was supposed to be the perfect trip, a 3-day escape to a lake so remote it wasn't even marked on the modern maps I found in the local gas station, and the old man behind the counter had looked at my gear with eyes that held a strange mixture of pity and dread, telling me that the fish in Black Glass Lake didn't taste like fish, but like old copper and sorrow. But I just laughed it off as a local superstition and drove my truck deep into the pines until the road disappeared into a carpet of dead needles and fog. And when I finally saw the water, it lived up to its name, looking like a sheet of obsidian poured into a hole in the earth, so still and so dark that it didn't reflect the sky, but seemed to swallow the light entirely. I unloaded my small aluminum boat and pushed off into the center of the lake as the sun began to dip behind the jagged horizon, turning the world into a landscape of bruised purples and long skeletal shadows, and the air was so heavy it felt like breathing through wet wool. But I didn't care because I was hunting for the legendary pike that supposedly lived in these depths, and I cast my line with a precision born of 2 decades of practice. Feeling the lure sink into the abyss, and for an hour there was nothing but the sound of the water lapping against the metal hull of my boat and the distant rhythmic croaking of frogs that sounded more like they were chanting a warning than making music. At exactly midnight, the fog rolled in so fast it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, and I couldn't see the shore anymore. I couldn't even see the tip of my own fishing rod, and suddenly the line went taut with a force that nearly pulled me over the side of the boat, and my heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird because whatever was on the other end felt massive and dead, like I had hooked a sunken log or a heavy anchor. But then it began to pull back with a slow, deliberate rhythm that felt like a heartbeat vibrating through the carbon fiber of the rod, and I began to reel it an inch by agonizing inch, my muscles screaming as I fought against the weight of the dark. The water began to boil and churn around the boat, even though there was no wind, and the smell of stagnant mud and rusted metal filled the air, making my stomach churn with a sudden violent nausea. And as the lure finally reached the surface, I didn't see a fish, but a glint of corroded metal reflecting the weak light of my headlamp. And I reached down with a gaff hook and pulled the object out of the water, expecting a piece of trash, but instead I found myself staring into the glass visor of a deep sea diving helmet from the early 1900s, covered in thick green slime and jagged barnacles that looked like tiny teeth. And as I held it in my hands, I realized with a jolt of pure electricity that the visor wasn't empty. I wiped away the layer of silt and mud from the glass, and my breath hitched in my throat because inside the helmet there was no skull, no bone, no rotting flesh, but a swirling vortex of black water that seemed to be moving with a life of its own. And then came the sound of wet metallic wheeze that vibrated from inside the iron, casing a heavy rhythmic breathing that sounded like someone was trying to draw air through a throat filled with salt and needles. And I dropped the helmet onto the floor of the boat, but instead of a hollow clang, it made a soft, organic thud, as if the metal had turned into skin, and the breathing grew louder, filling the silence of the lake until it was the only thing I could hear. I looked over the edge of the boat, and my blood turned into shards of ice because the water was no longer empty, but filled with hundreds of identical helmets bobbing just below the surface like a crop of iron fruit waiting to be harvested, and they were all slowly converging on my boat, their glass eyes glowing with a faint, sickly phosphorescence that illuminated the dark water from within. And I realized that the lake wasn't a body of water at all, but a mass grave for something that refused to stay buried. And as the first iron hand reached out of the depths and gripped the side of my boat, I knew that the fisherman had finally become the bait. The aluminum hull of my boat groaned under the weight of that first iron hand. and the sound was like a scream of tortured metal that echoed across the dead silence of the lake. I stared at those fingers, thick, encrusted with barnacles and dripping with a black, oily sludge that didn't behave like water, and I felt a primal terror that made my limbs feel like they were made of stone. The boat began to tilt sharply to the left, the gunwale dipping dangerously close to the obsidian surface, and I realized that the thing attached to that hand was immense, pulling itself up from a depth that should have been impossible for any living man to survive. I grabbed my heavy mag light and swung it toward the water, the beam cutting through the fog, and what I saw made me lose my grip on the flashlight. There were dozens of them, silhouettes of massive figures in archaic diving suits, standing on top of each other in the water, forming a human ladder of rusted iron and rotting canvas to reach me. I scrambled to the other side of the boat to balance the weight, my boots slipping on the slime-covered floor, and I kicked out at the iron hand with everything I had. My boot connected with the rusted metal of the gauntlet, but it felt like kicking a mountain. There was no give, no reaction, just that steady, rhythmic wheezing coming from the helmet I'd pulled up earlier. The helmet on the floor began to leak more of that black water, which started to pool around my feet, and wherever it touched my skin, it felt like liquid fire, searing through my socks and trousers. I realized then that these things weren't just trying to climb in, they were trying to drag the boat down into the throat of the lake to add me to the collection of souls trapped in those iron shells. With a desperate cry, I grabbed the emergency and began to jab at the visor of the creature that was now pulling its shoulders over the side of my boat. The glass cracked under the pressure, and instead of air rushing out, a geyser of that black, freezing water erupted, hitting me square in the chest and knocking the wind out of me. The creature didn't stop. It didn't have a face, just a void where a man should be, and it began to speak in a voice that sounded like 1,000 drowning men gurgling at once. It told me that the lake was hungry for the heat of my blood, that the cold of the deep was a loneliness that never ended, and that I would look beautiful in a suit of rusted iron. I felt its cold, wet grip close around my ankle, and the strength in that hand was enough to crush bone. I fumbled for the starter cord of my small outboard motor, praying to every god I had ever ignored that the engine would catch. I pulled once, nothing but a dry cough. I pulled a second time, and the cord snapped in my hand, leaving me clutching a frayed rope as the boat dipped even lower, water beginning to pour over the side. The creature's other hand reached for my throat, its fingers smelling of ancient salt and old death, and I saw the other helmets in the water getting closer, their visors glowing with that pale, sickly light. I was surrounded, trapped in the center of a black mirror, and as the creature pulled me toward the edge, I saw the surface of the lake begin to part, revealing a massive, rusted structure rising from the center of the water, a gate made of iron and bone that had been waiting for someone like me to open it from the inside. I knew if I didn't act in the next 3 seconds, I was going to be a permanent resident of Black Glass Lake. So I grabbed the pressurized canister of bear spray from my tackle box and jammed it directly into the broken visor of the thing pulling me down. I emptied the entire can into the black void of its head, and for the first time, the creature let out a sound, a high-pitched metallic shriek that shattered the glass of my remaining lanterns. It let go of my ankle and fell back into the water with a massive splash, and the sudden release caused the boat to rock violently, nearly throwing me into the arms of the others waiting below. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I grabbed the broken oar and began to row with a frantic, suicidal energy, my heart bursting in my chest as I felt the iron hands scratching against the bottom of the boat, searching for a grip in the dark. The scratching against the bottom of the boat sounded like 1,000 fingernails on a chalkboard, a frantic, rhythmic scraping that told me they were right beneath the thin sheet of aluminum, separated from me by only an inch of metal. I rowed until my palms bled, the broken or splintering in my hands, but the fog had turned the lake into a labyrinth where every direction looked like the way to certain death. I looked back and saw the center of the lake bulging, that massive gate of iron and bone rising higher, dripping with seaweed that looked like tangled hair, and I realized the lake wasn't just a grave, it was a mouth that was slowly opening to swallow the sky. The light from the helmets below the surface was getting brighter, turning the water into a glowing emerald graveyard, and I could see the shapes of the divers standing on the bottom. Hundreds of them, their long, tethered air hoses snaking upward like pale, parasitic worms. Suddenly, the boat stopped dead, as if I had hit a wall of solid ice, and a massive weight settled onto the bow. My headlamp flickered, and in the dying light, I saw him. A diver whose suit was different from the others, adorned with heavy brass chains and a helmet that looked like it had been forged in the fires of a nightmare. He didn't try to climb in. He just sat there, his weight pushing the front of the boat deep into the water, and he began to hum a melody that I recognized from my own childhood, a lullaby my mother used to sing to me when I was afraid of the dark. The sound was distorted, echoing through the brass of his helmet, and it felt like a cold needle being driven into my brain because there was no way this thing could know that song unless it had been watching me my entire life. He reached out a gauntlet hand and placed a small, wet object on the middle seat of the boat. It was my own wallet, the one I had lost in a different lake 10 years ago, but it was perfectly preserved, as if the water had kept it in a state of frozen time. The diver leaned forward, the visor of his helmet inches from mine, and I saw a reflection in the glass that wasn't me. It was a version of me that looked older, more exhausted, wearing the same rusted diving suit he was. He whispered that time doesn't exist at the bottom, that all things lost eventually find their way to Black Glass Lake, and that I had been invited here not as a victim, but as a replacement. The air hoses in the water began to writhe and lash out like whips, one of them wrapping around my waist, its surface covered in tiny, suction cup-like mouths that began to drain the warmth right out of my body. I felt a wave of crushing fatigue wash over me, the desire to just let go and sink into that beautiful, quiet green light becoming almost irresistible. My grip on the oar loosened, and I watched as my own hands began to turn a pale, waxy gray, the skin tightening over my knuckles like wet canvas. The diver in chains nodded his heavy head, encouraging me to step out of the boat and into the embrace of the deep, promising that the weight of the iron would feel like a mother's hug. But then I looked at the wallet on the seat, at the small, faded photo of my daughter tucked inside, and the sight of her smile acted like a jolt of lightning to my soul. I realized the lake wasn't just taking my life, it was trying to rewrite my history, to erase the man I was and turn me into another silent sentinel of the abyss. With a roar of defiance that tore my throat, I grabbed the heavy flare gun from the waterproof emergency kit at the back of the boat. I didn't aim it at the diver. I aimed it straight down at the black water pooling around my feet that had leaked from the first helmet. I pulled the trigger, and the magnesium flare erupted with a blinding, white-hot intensity that turned the interior of the boat into a miniature sun. The black water hissed and screamed, evaporating into a foul-smelling steam that blinded the chained diver and sent him reeling backward into the lake. The air hose around my waist shriveled and snapped, the tiny mouths popping like bubbles, and the sudden release of weight sent the boat lurching forward into the fog as the creatures below recoiled from the unnatural light of the flare. I was moving again, but the gate in the center of the lake was now fully open, and a current was beginning to pull everything, the water, the fog, and my boat, directly into its gaping iron maw. The pull of the center was absolute. It wasn't just a current. It felt like the lake had developed a gravitational field, a literal hole in the fabric of the world that was sucking the reality of the forest into its depths. My boat spun in slow, sickening circles, drawn toward that massive gate of bone and iron that now towered 30 feet above the water. The roar of the water rushing into the maw sounded like the low-frequency thrum of a jet engine, vibrating through my teeth and making my vision blur. Around me, the hundreds of diving helmets that had been bobbing on the surface were being sucked in as well, their pale lights spiraling down into the darkness like a galaxy of dying stars. I looked down at the floor of the boat and saw that the wood was beginning to transform. Where the black water had touched the aluminum, the metal was turning into rusted iron, and the seat beneath me was becoming soft, rotting canvas. The lake wasn't just trying to drown me anymore. It was literally converting me and my vessel into part of its archaic underwater world. I felt a sharp pain in my back and realized with horror that my spine was beginning to stiffen, my skin thickening into something that felt like heavy leather. I looked at my reflection in the dark water and saw the faint, ghostly outline of a brass collar forming around my neck. I was becoming one of them. In a desperate bid to slow my descent, I grabbed the heavy anchor chain and threw it with all my might toward a jagged rock that jutted out of the water near the edge of the vortex. The anchor caught with a jarring thud that nearly snapped my arms out of their sockets, and the boat jerked to a halt, straining against the tether. For a moment, I was suspended on the lip of the abyss, the bow of the boat hanging over the edge of the falling water. Below me, I could see the interior of the gate. It wasn't just a tunnel. It was a vast, flooded cathedral of rusted machinery and thousands of empty diving suits hanging from the ceiling like cocoons. And they weren't empty for long. The black water was flowing into them, inflating them with a hollow mimicry of life. Then the breathing returned, not from one helmet, but from the very air around me. The fog itself began to inhale and exhale. From the depths of the vortex, a massive, tentacled shape made of thousands of tangled air hoses rose up. At its center was a single, giant diving helmet, the size of a house, its visor cracked and leaking a golden, liquid light. This was the heart of the lake, the central intelligence that commanded the pack. It sensed my resistance, and the water around my boat began to rise in a defiant wave, forming a giant, translucent hand that reached down to pluck me from my tiny sanctuary. I realized then that my physical strength was useless. I couldn't outthrow this thing, and I couldn't outfight it. I reached into my bag and found my old flask of high-proof whiskey and a box of long-reach waterproof matches I used for campfires. My hand was shaking so violently, I nearly dropped them. I knew that if I could create a large enough explosion, the shockwave might disrupt the current long enough for me to cut the anchor and drift toward the shore. But as I prepared the makeshift bomb, the chain diver from before breached the surface right next to my boat. He didn't attack. Instead, he reached out and touched my hand, and for a split second our minds connected. I saw his memories. He was a fisherman just like me, 40 years ago, who had made the mistake of stopping to listen to the water. He wasn't trying to kill me. He was trying to warn me that the gate only closes when it is full, and it needed one more soul to complete the cycle. The connection with the chain diver felt like 1,000 needles of ice sewing my mind to his, and I saw the truth of Black Glass Lake. It was an anchor point for a world that had died before humanity even crawled out of the mud, a place where the concept of drowning was just the beginning of a long, iron servitude. The diver's hand was heavy, his metal gauntlet crushing my fingers, but his grip was also desperate. He showed me the only way out. The heart of the lake, that massive house-sized helmet, was sustained by a central tether, a thick umbilical cord of copper and bone that ran directly into the silt beneath the gate. The giant, translucent hand of water was now hovering directly above me, blocking out the sky, and the roar of the vortex was so loud it felt like my eardrums were about to burst. I looked at the whiskey flask in my hand, then at the flare gun, and I knew what I had to do. I didn't have enough explosives to destroy the gate, but I had enough to cause a distraction. I shoved the whiskey flask into the pocket of my jacket, grabbed the heavy anchor chain, and instead of staying in the boat, I did the one thing no sane fisherman would ever do. I jumped. The water hit me like a physical blow, a freezing darkness that tried to crush the air out of my lungs instantly, but the black sludge that had started to infect my veins gave me a horrific advantage. I didn't need to breathe. My lungs burned with a cold, liquid fire, and as I sank toward the maw of the gate, I saw the world from the perspective of the damned. Thousands of divers were standing on the slopes of the underwater crater, their visors all turned toward me, watching my descent with a silent, expectant hunger. I used the momentum of the current to propel myself toward the central umbilical cord, my body moving with a predatory grace that terrified me. I reached the massive tether, which was as thick as a redwood tree and pulsing with a sickly green light, and I saw that it wasn't made of metal, but of calcified nerves and rusted wire. The chain diver was right behind me, his heavy boots hitting the lake floor with a thud that sent up clouds of black silt. He handed me a jagged piece of rusted iron, a fragment of his own broken shackles, and together we began to saw at the cord. Every stroke of the iron felt like I was cutting into my own skin. The lake let out a subsonic groan that shook the very foundations of the earth, and the water around us began to boil with rage. The heart of the lake sensed the betrayal. The giant tentacles of air hoses descended from the vortex above, their suction cup mouths snapping at us like starving eels. One of them latched onto my shoulder, tearing through my jacket and skin, and I felt my memories beginning to drain away. The face of my daughter, the smell of the pines, the taste of morning coffee, all of it being pulled out of me to feed the machine. I screamed into the water, a cloud of black bubbles erupting from my throat, and with one final, desperate surge of strength, I jammed the flare gun directly into the wound we had carved in the umbilical cord and pulled the trigger. The explosion wasn't loud, but it was bright, a blinding, magnesium white that turned the depths of the lake into a hall of mirrors. The cord snapped with a sound like a cathedral bell cracking in half, and the green light in the divers' helmets flickered and died. The current instantly reversed, the vortex collapsing in on itself as the gate of bone and iron began to crumble, the massive structure falling apart like a house of cards. The sudden shift in pressure sent me hurtling upward, a ragdoll caught in an underwater hurricane, and the last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was the chain diver, his shackles finally gone, drifting peacefully down into the dark, his visor finally clear and empty. The sensation of rising was violent, a chaotic ascent through a column of freezing, churning foam that felt like it was trying to peel the skin from my bones. I was no longer a man. I was a piece of debris caught in the throat of a dying god. As I broke the surface, the air hit me like a physical punch, and I realized with a jolt of terror that the lake was no longer still. The collapse of the gate had created a massive, unstable swell, and the water was receding from the shoreline, pulling back as if the earth itself were taking a deep breath before a final scream. I gasped, coughing up thick, black fluid that tasted of salt and ancient oil, and I looked at my hands. The gray, waxy texture was still there, but it was cracking, flaking off in the wind to reveal raw, red skin beneath. I looked around for my boat, but it was gone, swallowed by the vortex or smashed to splinters against the rising bone gate. I was alone in the middle of a black sea that was now a graveyard of floating, empty diving suits. Without the heart to animate them, they were just hollow shells of canvas and lead, bobbing aimlessly in the dark like the molted skins of giant insects. The silence that followed the explosion was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. It was a heavy, expectant silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant, rhythmic thudding of something moving on the shore. I began to swim toward where I thought the truck was, my muscles screaming in protest, every stroke feeling like I was pulling myself through wet cement. But as I got closer to the edge of the forest, I saw that the trees weren't right. They were leaning toward the water, their branches dipping into the lake as if they were trying to drink, and the fog had turned a deep, bruised crimson. I dragged myself onto the muddy bank, my fingernails digging into the cold earth, and I lay there for a long time, listening to the forest breathe. The thudding sound grew louder, and I realized it wasn't a sound at all. It was a vibration coming from deep within the ground. The lake had been a seal, a plug for something much older than the divers, and by destroying the heart, I had broken that seal. I looked back at the water and saw a single, massive eye opening in the center of the lake bed, miles wide and glowing with a cold, pale intelligence that made the stars seem like dim sparks. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking so hard I could barely stand, and I ran. I didn't look back as I heard the sound of the water rushing back into the lake bed, a roar that sounded like 1,000 lions. I found my truck, the metal cold and covered in a fine layer of gray ash, and I fumbled for the keys in my pocket. My hands were still clumsy, the fingers long and slightly webbed, but I managed to turn the ignition. The engine groaned, sputtered, and then roared to life, the headlights cutting through the crimson fog like two spears of gold. As I shifted into gear and floored the gas, something slammed into the back of the truck. The entire vehicle lurched, the tires spinning in the mud, and I looked in the rearview mirror. A massive, rusted anchor, attached to a chain that seemed to go on forever into the dark woods, had hooked into the bumper. I wasn't being chased. I was being reeled in. The forest around me began to move, the trees shifting and sliding like the teeth of a giant gear, and I realized that Black Glass Lake didn't end at the shoreline. The whole valley was part of the machine, and I was just a small, broken part that was trying to escape its place in the engine. The chain groaned with a sound that felt like it was ripping the soul out of the truck's chassis. I shoved the shifter into 4 low and floored it, the tires screaming as they tore through the mud and roots. But the anchor held fast, dragging me backward toward the lapping, hungry edge of the water. I looked in the mirror and saw the forest itself beginning to tilt, the ground folding like paper as the lake bed expanded to reclaim the land. The massive eye in the center of the lake was now staring directly at me through the trees, its gaze a physical weight that made my nose bleed and my vision turn a hazy, static blue. I realized I couldn't outrun a god that owned the very ground I was driving on. I reached for my heavy hunting knife, the one with the staghorn handle my father gave me, and I threw myself out of the moving cab. I landed hard on the jagged rocks, my shoulder popping out of its socket, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to the back of the truck just as the bumper began to tear away. I didn't cut the chain, I couldn't, but I jammed the knife into the hitch mechanism, levering it with every ounce of my 40 years of survival until the metal snapped with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. The truck surged forward, empty, disappearing into the red fog, while the anchor and the bumper were snapped back into the woods with a violent, whipping force. I lay there in the mud, staring up at the sky, which was no longer black but a deep, bruised gold. The giant eye below the water slowly began to close, the lid a continent of silt and shadow, as the lake realized the part it had tried to reclaim was broken beyond repair. The silence returned, but it wasn't the silence of the woods. It was the silence of a grave that had been satisfied for now. I crawled for miles, my body a map of scars and gray, flaking skin, until I found a service road and was picked up by a local ranger who looked at my webbed fingers and the black fluid leaking from my ears and never asked a single question. He just drove in a terrified, white-knuckled silence. It has been 6 months since that night at Black Glass Lake. I live in the desert now, in a place where the air is so dry the skin on my face cracks and peels, and there isn't a body of water larger than a puddle for 100 miles in any direction. I sold all my gear, the rods, the lures, the boat, and I burned every photo I had of myself near the water. But the change didn't fully go away. My hands are still a little too long, my skin a little too pale, and when I stand in the shower, I catch myself trying to breathe the steam as if it were liquid. People in town call me the dry man because I refuse to drink anything but bottled water and I never leave my house when it rains. They think I'm just another crazy veteran or a drifter who saw too much, but they don't see what I see when I look in the mirror after midnight. I don't see Arthur anymore. I see a shadow behind my own eyes, a flickering green light that pulses in time with a heart that isn't entirely human. I know that the lake is still out there, a sleeping giant waiting for the next man with a kind heart, or a lonely soul to cast a line into its obsidian depths. I survived, but I didn't win. You don't win against something that was here before the sun. You just negotiate for a few more years of sunlight. Now, whenever I see a fisherman on the side of the road, I don't wave. I don't stop. I just keep driving until the road turns to dust, because I know that once you've felt the weight of the iron and the pull of the deep, you never truly stop drowning. You're just waiting for the water to come back and finish what it started. And every night, in the dry, desert heat, I can still hear the rhythmic, metallic wheezing of a diving helmet under my bed, reminding me that I'm still on the hook.